Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament. And today we're going to be looking at Paul speaking to Agrippa. Yesterday we saw Paul speak to Festus, but the day before that we saw Paul speak to Felix. And so again, it's just a series of kind of trials and questioning that Paul has to go through over really a 2 year period that we're looking at here. Now, I'm not going to read today's. This is a very long one. It really is a summary of Paul's life and ministry, and it goes from Acts 25:23 all the way to 26:32. So I encourage you to take the time if you haven't, pause, read it, or if you just want to listen to the notes here, then go back and read it and look at it that way. But yeah, it's there's a lot in there, and so I didn't want to just read all this to you because a lot of us we've already gone through in Acts, and so I'm going to we'll go through it, basically go through the notes here and look at all this. And so basically Paul's hearing before King Agrippa was accompanied by all the pomp and circumstance appropriate for an official royal visit. And so that we see there. And the main purpose for the hearing was for Agrippa to advise Festus on basically what he should do and write to Caesar, right? For there was no clear charge against Paul, and Festus himself believed Paul had done nothing to deserve death. So it's like, well, so what should I send? So basically, he has Agrippa helping him to send this letter to Caesar. And so what we see here is in his eloquent defense, Paul's eloquent defense is before King Agrippa, right? He argued that his preaching was completely consistent with the Jewish faith. And his defense begins with a courteous acknowledgement. Again, we kind of seen the same pattern through most of the other stuff that we've seen here. Acknowledgement of his competence to hear the evidence, right? It outlines the nature of Paul's background, his Jewish training, his member of the fact that he was a member of the Pharisees, and explains that the charges against him are merely for believing that the fulfillment of the Jewish hope of the resurrection. And so he's like, look, I've been through all this. This is my history. This is who I studied under, all these things. And so Paul then tells his story of the conversion on the road to Damascus, right? He talks about how he went from a strong opponent of Christianity, even being involved in the murder of Christians, through a vision on the way to Damascus, and we've looked at that if you've been following along with us through this whole process. And so his preaching, right, that he's saying, look, my preaching is nothing more than obeying the divine vision from Jesus Christ. And so, even though, right, he talks about, even though he encountered violent opposition from his fellow Jews, he was stoned, right, he's almost killed several times. God protected him as he taught a message that the Jews should have embraced, but he taught it to the Gentiles, right? And so this defense is a model. All right, this defense here is a model for Christians put on trial for their faith. I mean, if you look at everything that Paul said, he stuck to it. He didn't get angry. He didn't get violent. He didn't get any of that stuff. He just spoke the truth, right? And so finally, Festus says, Paul, you are insane, right? He tells him you're insane. He said he thought all this talk about the prophets and the resurrection was crazy. And basically he concluded that Paul had driven himself mad with too much study. He's like, look, man, you've studied too much. You've basically, ruined your mind because you've done it. And so Luke talks about, he writes about how these things were not done in a corner, right? Basically, all these major events of the Christian faith were historical matters of fact. They were public record. Everyone really knew about these things, and so none of the witnesses could attest to the fact that they were true. So everyone knew what Paul was saying was the true, and so and Agrippa himself could not invalidate Paul's statement of faith. And so Paul questions Agrippa about it, right, and puts him in a bind. Because if he said that he believed the prophets, he knew Paul would press home, right, to the Christian message. But if not, he would offend all the devout Jews in the audience. And so Agrippa knew, right? Agrippa knew that Paul wasn't crazy. He understood enough. He knew that Paul's testimony about Jesus was historically sound, that it was historically correct. So Agrippa avoided the question, right? He evaded Paul's question. And he refused to face the claims of Christ, alleging that the statement given by Paul was too brief. Basically, I haven't had enough time to study this or do this. And he basically says to him, do you think you can persuade me to become a Christian so quickly? Another translation has a little more in your arguments would have made me a Christian, is what it's saying. And so this remark, it might have been ironic. It could have been incredulous. It could have been scoffing, right? Or it could have just been brushing off Paul's challenge. We don't really know the context. We don't know the tone since we weren't there. But it also may have been a direct statement to Paul's persuasiveness. It may have been to say, hey, or it may have been a direct statement about a genuine question of Paul's intentions. But it seems best, right, to take Agrippa's reply as deliberately evasive. He didn't want to admit that he believed the prophets, right? For Paul, right? Paul had made a really strong case. And so he didn't want to say he didn't believe the prophets. And the next step, it would have been to believe in Jesus, right? As the promised Messiah to whom the prophets were. And so, and Agrippa didn't want to take that next step yet. I don't know if he didn't want to take it at all, but he definitely didn't want to take it right here in front of everyone. But on the other hand, he didn't want to say that he didn't believe the prophets, because if he said that, right, that would alienate all his Jewish subjects, to whose loyalties he wanted to appeal. And so he basically gives a non-committal response that that underlined his discomfort with Paul's testimony, because he saw this. Paul made a good case. He couldn't go against it. Festus just said he was insane because he was Roman. He didn't understand all this, but excuse me, Agrippa did. And I think deep down in the context of this, I think Agrippa knew Paul was right, but he didn't want to confess that in front of everyone. And so Paul's bold answer shows his quickness, right? His response to him in this. Go back and read it, because this is a really good. It shows Paul how good Paul was at this stuff. He challenges Agrippa and his whole audience about the value of knowing Christ and making a personal commitment to it. So the consensus of all the rulers here was that Paul's done nothing wrong, right? This was been the consensus, especially to deserve death or imprisonment. He'd been in prison for over 2 years now. And this verdict was given repeatedly by the Roman authorities. And so after all this conversation, Agrippa, basically saying, almost persuaded, right? We have songs about that. And, but in the end, he doesn't, and he's like, hey, right, we know that, we know you've done nothing wrong. We know you've done, especially to deserve jail or death, right? And then in the end, he's like, he could have been set free. If he hadn't appealed to Caesar, he could have been set free. But if he hadn't appealed to Caesar, more than likely this would have taken place in Jerusalem. All this would have taken place in Jerusalem, and so Paul might not have been alive to even give this. And so that's the other side of this. And so, but in the end, as we know, God promised him that he was going to go to Rome, and this was the way of Agrippa and them fulfilling God's promise for him and basically getting Paul to Rome. And so we're going to see now. We're going to see Paul's, after all this discussion, after these 2 years in imprisonment, meeting in front of all these people, answering questions against the accusations, and testifying about Jesus Christ and Paul's own ministry. We're going to finally see now Paul in Acts 27 set sail for Rome, and that's not going to be an easy trip either. None of this, Paul getting to Rome, is not easy for him at all. Well, for whatever reason, God allows a lot of things to happen. We're going to see all that, and so we'll continue that this week. Like I said, tomorrow we'll look at Paul sailing for Rome, and we'll continue these. And so, as always, I appreciate everyone who takes the time to watch these. I hope you're learning from them, and I encourage you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't done so yet, because we're going to continue to go, hopefully, dive deeper and deeper. We could have, I probably could have spent a couple of days on this one, and maybe I should have split this into a couple of days. But there's plenty of notes here, and I just encourage you to read it and just take the time to read, because it's a really good example of presenting ourselves as Christian, especially for someone who's under trial. I hope we never are, but it really is a good example. So again, encourage you to subscribe to the channel. And as always, I appreciate everyone who takes the time to watch these, and I hope you have a wonderful day.